Picture it. It's 1983. You're sitting in a cold, sterile interrogation room in Paris. For 20 years, you've risked everything for the love of your life. You lied to your family. You betrayed your country. You smuggled hundreds of classified documents out of embassies, all to protect the family you built in the shadow of the Cold War. But the French authorities have finally caught up with you. You and your partner are arrested for espionage. Your world is crashing down. But the treason? The threat of prison? That's not the tragedy of this story. The real devastation comes when the medical examiner walks in your cell, holds up a chart, and shatters your reality with a single sentence. A secret your partner has kept for you for 2 decades, a lie so absolute, so intimately woven into your everyday life that it defies all logic. Before we step back into the 1960s in Beijing, I have a quick favor to ask. If you're enjoying the show, make sure to hit that follow button and leave a rating on whatever platform you're using right now. It's really the best way to help the show grow. I also really want to hear from you guys on this one. As the story unfolds, I guarantee you're going to have thoughts about it. Drop a comment, ask questions, or just come yell about how wild this case is over on our socials. You can find all the links to join the community right down in the show notes. All right, grab your tea, dim the lights, and let's get into it. To understand how Shi Pei Pu managed to pull off one of the most elaborate deceptions in modern history, we have to look at his foundation. His early life perfectly positioned him at the exact intersection of language, espionage, and the art of illusion. Shi Pei Pu was born on December 21st, 1938, in Shandong province, but he grew up in Kunming in southwestern China. He wasn't born into poverty or obscurity. He came from a highly educated, intellectual family. His father was a university professor, and his mother was a teacher. Schur was incredibly bright and possessed a natural gift for languages. He learned French at a young age, eventually graduating from Kunming University with a degree in literature. In the 1960s, communist China, being fluent in French wasn't just a party trick, it was rare and a highly valuable commodity. It gave him access to a world completely closed off from the average Chinese citizen. After university, Schur moved to Beijing. He became a playwright, a librettist, and a singer. But his most crucial connection was the Beijing Opera. In traditional Beijing opera, women are historically banned from the stage. Because of this, male actors trained for years to play the female roles, a tradition known as dan. These actors didn't just put on a dress, they mastered the hyper feminine nuances of movement, voice, and psychology required to embody a woman on stage. While Shi Pei Pu was primarily a writer and not a famous dan performer himself, he was deeply immersed in this world. He understood the mechanics of gender performativity. He knew exactly how a man could convince an audience he was a woman using civility, modesty, and theatricality. By the 1960s, Beijing was intense. It was intense and isolated. The Cold War was raging, and Chairman Mao's government kept a suffocating grip on the citizens. Western diplomats living in Beijing were essentially quarantined in their own compounds and heavily monitored by the secret police. Shi Pei Pu became a rare bridge between these two paranoid worlds. Because of his flawless French and his polite, intellectual demeanor, he was hired to teach Chinese to the families of the French diplomats. He was moving freely inside the diplomatic bubbles while simultaneously reporting back to his state employers. He was charming, non threatening, and culturally fascinating to the isolated Westerners. By the winter of 1964, Shi Pei Pu is 26 years old. He is elegant, soft spoken, and possesses a delicate, androgynous beauty. He is well known within the French expat community as a cultured playwright and tour. Anyways, I'm gonna butcher the French name, but I'll do the best I can. Meanwhile, a 20-year-old French accountant named Bernard Boursicot has arrived in Beijing. Working at the newly opened French embassy, Bernard is desperate for adventure. culturally naive, and obsessed with the romanticized, exotic idea of the Orient. So let's meet Bernard. He is born in 1944 in the Brittany region of France. Bernard was not an intellectual or an aristocrat. He was a working class kid who felt completely suffocated by his mundane provincial life. Bernard was obsessed with adventure. He devoured literature and movies about the exotic East and the far off lands. He didn't just want to travel, he wanted to be the hero in the adventure novel. He wanted a grand, sweeping narrative for his life, something entirely different from the rainy coast of France. Bernard was walking around with a script already written in his head. He was actively looking for a damsel to rescue, a secret to keep, and a romance that defied the odds. He was practically begging the universe to give him a movie plot. This is perhaps the most crucial psychological element of the entire case, and one that really anchors the themes of what we do here at Homocidal Tendency. Before leaving France, Bernard, I'm probably just going to start calling him Bernard, which is my American way of saying it. Bernard was struggling with his own identity. He had experienced several sexual encounters with men in his youth, but in the rigid conservative society of 1960s France, this caused him intense internal conflict. He desperately wanted to prove to himself and to the world that he was a traditional man. He believed that if he could just find the right woman, a pure, epic love, it would quote unquote fix him. He went to China looking for a heterosexual romance that would validate his masculinity. In 1964, a massive geopolitical shift happens. Under President Charles de Gaulle, France becomes the first major Western power to officially recognize Mao's communist China, and they open an embassy in Beijing. Bernard, hungry for adventure, manages to get a posting there, but he isn't some suave James Bond style intelligence officer. He's a 20-year-old accountant and clerk. He is literally the guy in charge of the embassy's filing cabinets and the diplomatic pouch. When he arrives in Beijing, it's not the romantic, vibrant Orient he had read about in the books. It's the eve of a cultural revolution. The city is gray, the winters are brutal, and the locals are forbidden from speaking to foreigners. And the Westerners, they're basically locked inside their heavily surveilled diplomatic compounds. By December 1964, Bernard is incredibly lonely, totally disillusioned, and culturally isolated. He's a 20-year-old kid surrounded by older, cynical diplomats. He is starved for connection, romance, and anything that resembles the adventure he was promised. He is, in espionage terms, the perfect mark. You have the brilliant, bilingual performer who understands the art of gender illusion, and you have the lonely, sexually conflicted young clerk who is desperate to play the hero in a tragic romance. It's Christmas time, 1964. The newly established French embassy in Beijing is throwing a holiday cocktail party. Outside the compound walls, China is gray and freezing, but inside, the champagne is flowing. Enter 20-year-old Bernard. He's standing on the edges of the room, sipping a drink, feeling completely out of place among the older diplomats. He's looking for a spark. He's looking for his movie moment. And then he sees him. Across the room is 26-year-old Chinese playwright Shi Pei Pu. Shi is tutoring the families of the French diplomats, which is why he's at the party. He is slight, elegant, and possesses the quiet, magnetic energy he desires. He's dressed in men's clothing, but there's a softness to his features that immediately catches Bernard's eyes. Bernard approaches, and the moment Shi opens his mouth, the young Frenchman is a goner. Shi speaks flawless, beautiful French. They don't talk about politics or the weather. They talk about art. They talk about the sweeping tragedy of the Beijing Opera. For Bernard, this isn't just a conversation, it's a lifeline. It's the exotic, romanticized version of the Orient he had been desperately searching for since he got off the plane. But Shi Pei Pu is brilliant. He doesn't just flatter Bernard. He starts laying the foundation for a 20-year illusion right there at the Christmas party. Shi tells Bernard a story. It's a famous Chinese legend called the Butterfly Lovers. It's a tragic tale about a young woman who is forbidden from getting an education, so she disguises herself as a man. While disguised, she meets a young male scholar, and they become best friends. The scholar never realizes that she's a woman until it's too late, and their doomed love story ends with both of them dying and turning into butterflies. Bernard is enchanted by the story, but he doesn't realize that Sure isn't just making conversation. He's planting a seed. He's testing the waters to see if this young, naive Westerner will buy into the trope of the disguised maiden. The party ends, but the hook is set. They arrange to meet again in private. But before we get to the romance, we need to talk about why Shi Pei Pu was at this French diplomatic party in the first place, because he wasn't just there to sip champagne. We tend to think about spies as highly trained operatives in tactical gear pulling off impossible heists. But in 1964 Beijing, under Chairman Mao, the intelligence apparatus didn't need to train you to be a spy. They just drafted you. When France opened its embassy, the Chinese government was terribly paranoid. They didn't trust these Westerners, but they needed to keep an eye on them. So, the state allowed a very small, heavily vetted group of Chinese citizens to interact with the diplomats. Shi Pei Pu, with his flawless French and elegant manners, was selected to teach Chinese to the families of the French embassy workers. But in Mao's China, a job like that comes with a massive, terrifying string attached. You couldn't just teach the foreigners and go home. You were required by laws to report everything you saw and heard back to the secret police. The Ministry of the State Security assigned Shi a handler, a high ranking intelligence officer named Kang. Every conversation Shi had with a French diplomat's wife, every piece of gossip he overheard in the embassy hallways, every detail about their routines, he had to take that straight to Kang. If Shi refused, or if he was suspected of holding back information, he would immediately be branded an enemy of the state. He would lose his comfortable life, his career in the theater, and he would likely be shipped off to a brutal labor camp. So, what was Shi Pei Pu's motive? It wasn't money. It wasn't even necessarily patriotism. It was pure, unadulterated survival. By the time December 1964 rolls around, Shi has already learned how to play the game. He knows how to charm the Westerners, and he knows how to feed the intelligence to his handlers to keep himself safe. So, when Cher walks into that Christmas cocktail party and locks eyes with a lonely, naive 20-year-old French clerk named Bernard, he's already on the clock. He wasn't looking for a husband. He was looking for an asset. A few weeks later, safely away from the prying eyes of the embassy, Shi Pei Pu finally springs the trap. Echoing the exact legend he told at the Christmas party, Cher looks at Bernard and delivers the lie that will ruin both their lives. I'm like the girl in the story, he whispers. I'm a woman. My mother already had 2 daughters, and my father demanded a son. So, to save my mother's honor, I have been forced to live my entire life in disguise. And Bernard, the kid who wanted to be the hero of his own sweeping romance, he bought it hook, line, and sinker. When Cher claimed to be a woman in disguise, and when their affair began, the danger of 1964's Beijing acted like an accelerant. The fact that their love was forbidden, that they could be arrested or killed if they were caught, it didn't deter Bernard. It made the romance feel epic. It made him feel like a hero. The secret police weren't just a threat, they were the very thing that made the illusion feel so intoxicatingly real. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the physical relationship. Bernard and Cher, they were intimate. They were lovers. So how did Cher, a biological male, convince Bernard that he was a woman during their most vulnerable moments? It wasn't magic. It was a masterclass in manipulation, staging, and exploiting a culture Bernard barely understood. First, Cher weaponized modesty. We have to remember the context. It's 1960s communist China. The culture was intensely conservative. Cher told Bernard that as a traditional, respectable Chinese woman, she was deeply ashamed of her body. Sorry, it's ridiculous. She was deeply ashamed of her body. Modesty wasn't just a performance, it was a matter of honor. And because of this shame, Cher laid down strict ground rules for their intimacy. It was always in pitch black darkness. There was no candles, no moonlight streaming through the window. Bernard was never allowed to see Cher undress, and he was rarely allowed to touch below the waist with his hands. But what about the actual physical act? This is where Cher's knowledge of the human body and his theatrical background came into play. According to medical examiners, a year later, Shi Pei Pu likely had a physical anomaly, a retracted penis, and he was able to tuck his genitalia away completely. So we're talking about a tuck that RuPaul would be proud of. During their fleeting dark encounters, Sher would position himself very specifically. He guided Bernard to engage in what was essentially sex by squeezing his thighs tightly together to create friction. It was quick, it was heavily restricted, and to a young, sexually inexperienced guy who was desperate to believe he was making love to a woman, it felt real enough. But the physical mechanics were only half the trick. The real deception happened in Bernard's mind. Shi Pei Pu used his knowledge of the Beijing Opera. Shi knew exactly how to sigh, how to shift his weight, and how to act demure and fragile. He played the role of the tragic, delicate maiden flawlessly. And Bernard? Bernard was the perfect audience of one. Remember, he went to China desperate to prove his own heterosexuality. He wanted a traditional, epic romance with a woman. So, whenever his brain registered something slightly off, a physical inconsistency, a voice that was a bit too deep, a strange restriction in the bed, his mind, it aggressively smoothed it over. It's the ultimate true crime concept. Confirmation bias. Bernard didn't see the truth because the truth would have destroyed the fantasy he needed to survive. He was actively participating in his own deception. But a romance in the dark can only last so long. To lock Bernard down, Sure needed something permanent, something that would bind the young diplomat to him forever, and force him to cross a line he could never uncross. Sure needed a miracle. He needed a baby. By late 1965, the clock is ticking on this forbidden romance. Bernard's tour in Beijing is coming to an end. He is scheduled to be rotated out of China. The fantasy is about to hit the harsh reality of the international border. But just before Bernard is set to leave, Shi Pei Pu drops a bombshell. I'm pregnant. For Bernard, this is it. This is the absolute, undeniable proof of everything he wants to believe. If Sure is pregnant, then she is undoubtedly a woman. His masculinity is validated. They're going to be a family. The movie plot playing out in his head, it's just reached its triumphant second act. But there's a massive problem. In 1965 China, an unwed pregnancy is a scandal. An unwed pregnancy with a Western foreigner is a death sentence, or at very least, a one way ticket to a brutal labor camp. Sher tells Bernard that he's going to leave Beijing. He's going to travel to the remote mountainous countryside to hide the pregnancy from the authorities, to have the baby in secret, and to wait for Bernard to return. Bernard leaves China, agonizing over the wife and the unborn child he's left behind. He spends the next few years stationed in the Middle East and then back in France, absolutely desperate to get back to his family. Meanwhile, back in China, Shi Pei Pu has a logistical nightmare to solve. How does a biological man produce a half French baby? The answer is both heartbreaking and chillingly resourceful. Shi travels to Zhejiang region in the far west of China. There he finds a doctor who has access to orphans. Shi purchases a young baby boy. He names him Shi Dudu. 4 years later, in late 1969, Bernard finally manages to get a new posting that puts him close enough to China he can visit. He travels to Beijing, his heart is pounding, and he reunites with Shi. And there, waiting for him, is a 4-year-old boy. Bernard looks at the child, and his confirmation bias kicks into overdrive. He's searching the boy's face, and he sees exactly what he desperately wants to see. His own eyes, his own features. He sees a mixed race child. He sees his son. In Bernard's mind, the trap snaps entirely shut. He's a father. He has a wife. He has a family trapped behind the Iron Curtain. But this family reunion wasn't a secret. The Chinese intelligence apparatus, who had likely been monitoring their relationship from the very beginning, they saw their opportunity. They had the perfect leverage over a French official. Shi Pei Pu, acting on behalf of the secret police, gives Bernard a devastating ultimatum. The authorities, they know about our relationship. They know about Dudu. And the only way to keep them safe, the only way Bernard will ever be allowed to see his family again, is if he starts paying the toll. And the currency they wanted, it wasn't money. It was secrets. The trap is completely shut. Bernard believes he's a father. He believes the woman he loves and their young son are trapped in Beijing. And right on cue, the Chinese secret police step out of the shadows. It happens in late 1969. Bernard is reassigned to Beijing, finally reuniting with his family. But Shi Pei Pu comes to him, terrified. Like we said, they've discovered their relationship. They know about the French diplomat and the Chinese citizen and the mixed race child. In Mao's China, this is a crime that can easily result in execution or labor camp. But Shi tells Bernard there's a way out. A high ranking intelligence officer known only as Kang has offered them a deal. Kang says that he will look the other way, that he will allow Shi to keep his job, and he will allow little Dudu to be safe. All Bernard has to do is to prove his friendship to the People's Republic of China. They wanted intel, and Bernard, terrified for his family, didn't hesitate. He crossed the line from naive lover to active traitor. Now, when we think of Cold War espionage, we think of James Bond, microfilm, dead drops, hidden cameras. But Bernard was an archivist and an accountant. He literally managed the filing cabinets for the French embassy. His method of espionage was shockingly simple. During his shifts, he would wait until he was alone in the secure filing room. He would pull the classified cables, reports, and diplomatic correspondence and simply stuff them in his coat pockets or a briefcase. Then he'd walk right out the front door of the embassy, past the guards, and ride his bicycle in the freezing Beijing night. He would meet Shi Pei Pu in secret. He'd hand over the stolen documents. Shi would then pass them to his handler Kang, who would photograph them and then return the originals to Shi. A few hours later, Bernard would smuggle the papers back into the embassy and put them back in the files before anyone noticed they were missing. This went on for years, between 1969 and 1972 in Beijing, and then later during a posting in Mongolia. Bernard handed over an estimated 500 confidential documents to Chinese intelligence. Now, was he handing over nuclear launch codes? No. Most of what he had access to were low level diplomatic cables, political assignments, and internal French embassy gossip. But the Chinese intelligence apparatus, they devoured it. It gave them an unprecedented, unfiltered look into how the West was operating and what they were thinking. As we know, Bernard was not doing this for money. He wasn't doing it because he believed in the communist cause. Every single time he stuffed a classified document into his coat, risking a treason charge that carries a life sentence in France, he did it to keep Shi Pei Pu and Dudu alive. He was paying the ransom for his family on an installment plan. But as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, Bernard couldn't take the separation and the terror anymore. He decided he had to get his family out of China. No matter the cost, he was going to bring them to Paris. This is the chapter where the incredible luck of Shi Pei Pu finally runs out. For almost 20 years, the deception was protected by the shadows of Beijing and thousands of miles between Bernard and his home country. We need to fast forward just a bit to understand how this all falls apart. By 1979, Bernard's time as a diplomat was over. His final posting in Mongolia wraps up, and with it, his access to classified French documents. The espionage stops, not because of some grand moral awakening, but simply because he no longer has the keys to the filing cabinets. Bernard moves back to Paris. He transitions back into a civilian life. He gets a regular job and even starts building a new life for himself. He actually moves in with a new partner, a man named Terry. I'm not going to try to say the French pronunciation of Terry. I'm just going to say Terry. Anyways, for all intents and purposes, Bernard's time as a Cold War spy, it's a closed chapter now. He's got away with it. But there's a massive, unresolved thread dangling halfway across the world. Even though Bernard has a new life, a new partner, he still believes he has a wife and a teenage son trapped behind the Iron Curtain. He still feels the overwhelming sense of duty and guilt. So, in 1982, Bernard makes the fatal life-altering mistake. He reaches out to his old government contacts. He pulls every string, cashes in every favor, and manages to secure cultural visas for Shi Pei Pu and their now 16-year-old son, Shi Dudu, to come to France. When Shi and Dudu finally land in Paris, okay. I was trying to keep it professional, but the Dudu's cracking me up. I know. I'm an idiot. Anyways, back to it. When Shi and now 16-year-old Dudu finally land in Paris in 1982, the reality of Bernard's double life collides in the most spectacular, messy way possible. Let's set the scene in Bernard's apartment. By this point, Bernard is living as an openly gay man. He has a long term boyfriend named Terry. They share a life, an apartment, and a bed. But Bernard has never fully let go of the fantasy he built in Beijing. He still fundamentally believes that Shi Pei Pu is his fragile, tragic wife, and that Dudu is his biological son. So Bernard has to sit his boyfriend Terry down and explain this Chinese wife and teenage son are coming to stay. Imagine being Terry in this scenario. Your boyfriend brings home a middle aged Chinese performer who dresses in men's clothes but insists on being treated with the difference of a matriarch, along with a teenage son who calls your boyfriend Papa. The living situation, it becomes an absolute circus. First, there's the financial and emotional strain. Bernard is suddenly trying to play the dutiful, protective patriarch to Shir and Dudu while simultaneously maintaining his romantic relationship with Terry. Then there's the radical transformation of Shi Pei Pu. In Beijing, Shir survived by being a ghost, modest, terrified, and hidden in the dark. But in Paris, Shir realizes he has an audience. He completely sheds the frightened maiden persona and essentially becomes a Parisian diva. Shir starts spending Bernard's money. He demands to be taken to the best restaurants. He starts networking with the French aristocrat community. He actually manages to get booked on national French television, performing traditional Chinese opera. Meanwhile, you have 16-year-old Dudu caught in the middle of this chaos. He's been pulled out of communist China and dropped into 1980s Paris. He's living with his mother, who is actively performing on TV, and his father, who is with another man. The cognitive dissonance Bernard had to maintain during this period is staggering. He was sleeping with a man, yet fiercely defending Shir's identity as a woman to anyone who asked, including his own family. He introduced Shir to his parents as his female companion. It was a house of cards built on 2 decades of lies, forced into an apartment that was way too small to hold them. The tension in between Shir's demanding new persona and Terry's presence created a deeply fractured, volatile household. And it was this exact loud, messy, incredibly public domestic drama that made them a glaring target. If Shir had just stayed quiet, they might have lived out their days in a weird, complicated peace. But Shir's need for the spotlight acted like a flare gun, signaling directly to the French intelligence, "Look at us." And the DST, they were more than happy to look. You see, when a former French embassy worker who used to be stationed in Beijing during the height of the Cold War, and you suddenly import a Chinese national on a cultural visa, the French intelligence service, the DST, it's going to notice. The DST pulls Bernard's old files. They start looking at the dates he was stationed in Beijing and Mongolia. They look at the archive logs. They notice during those exact windows, hundreds of classified documents went missing. And now, here is this flamboyant Chinese cultural performer sleeping in the former diplomat's apartment, going on French television, drawing massive amounts of attention. But to Bernard, he has finally reunited his complicated family. To the French government, it's a hostile spy ring that just set up shop in the middle of Paris. Then the bizarre, chaotic domestic life in Bernard's Parisian apartment is completely shattered. Agents from the DST, the French counterintelligence agency, they swarm the building. They tear through the apartment, confiscating letters, documents, and anything that ties Bernard back to his time in Beijing. They arrest Shi Pei Pu on the spot. Simultaneously, agents track down Bernard at his new job and slap handcuffs on him. They're thrown into the back of separate cars and taken to the DST headquarters. Let's look at this from Bernard's perspective first. He's sitting in an interrogation room. He's terrified, facing charges of high treason, a crime that carries a massive prison sentence. But now, his primary concern isn't his own freedom, it's his family. Bernard thinks he's the tragic hero. He thinks if he just explains the truth, that He only stole documents to protect his fragile Chinese wife and their teenage son from the secret police. The French authorities will understand. He thinks his story of an epic romance, not cold calculating espionage, will save the day. So Bernard confesses. He spills everything. He details the hundreds of documents he smuggled out of the embassy in Beijing and Mongolia. He explains the blackmail. He explains that he did it all for Shi Pei Pu and his son. The interrogators, they just stare at him. They look at his file. They look at the evidence they've gathered over the months of surveillance, and then they drop the first bomb. They tell Bernard that Shi Pei Pu is not a woman. Bernard laughs. He gets angry. He aggressively defends Shi. He tells the agents that they're crazy. They're insulting the mother of his child. He insists that Shi's modesty and traditional Chinese upbringing are being misunderstood by the crass Westerners. He is absolute in his conviction. Meanwhile, in a different interrogation room down the hall, Shi Pei Pu is playing a very different game. He's a survivor. He's played every side against the middle for 2 decades. When the DST interrogators start pressing him, he doesn't break down. He doesn't confess to being a master spy. Instead, he leans into the persona he built. He plays the victim. He claims he was just an artist caught in the crossfire of international politics. But the DST doesn't care about his performance. They have a massive problem on their hands. They have a former diplomat confessing to treason for a wife and a suspected Chinese spy who talks and dresses like a man. The French legal system requires undeniable proof to proceed with the charges and to break Bernard's delusion. They need to establish the absolute facts of the case. And so the interrogators give an order that will end the illusion forever. They call a doctor. They order a full invasive medical examination of Shi Pei Pu, not in a hospital, right there in the confines of the detention center. For 20 years, Shi had successfully hidden in the dark, using shadows, modesty, and theatricality to mask his physical reality. But there's no more shadows, not in this French medical examination room. There's only the doctor, a chart, and the cold, clinical truth. Inside the French detention center, the medical examination is quick, clinical, and completely unambiguous. The doctor examines Shi. He notices the physical anomaly, the ability to tuck and conceal, but there's no medical mystery here. The doctor signs his name to a piece of paper that will destroy 2 lives. Shi Pei Pu is biologically, undeniably male. Down the hall, Bernard is sitting in his cell. He's already confessed to high treason. He thinks he's a martyr for love. The investigating magistrate walks into Bernard's room and lays the medical report on the table. He looks at the former diplomat, this man who betrayed his country, and delivers the facts. Your wife, the magistrate says, is a man. Bernard's reaction, it isn't shock, it's outrage. He vehemently denies it. He calls the authorities liars. He accuses them of trying to play a cruel psychological game to break him. He is so deeply entrenched in the fantasy he built in 1964 that his brain literally cannot process the information on the paper. He demands proof. He refuses to believe it unless he sees it with his own eyes. So, the French authorities do something incredibly cruel, but legally necessary. They arrange a confrontation. They bring Shi and Bernard together. The details of this exact encounter vary slightly in historical records. Some say it was in a shared transport. Others say it was in a room in the detention center, but the outcome is the same. Bernard looks at the person he has loved for 2 decades, the person who he sacrificed his career, his freedom, and his country for. And Shi is forced to drop the act. There's no traditional modesty. There's no darkened room. Shi reveals his physical reality to Bernard. And in that single agonizing moment, 20 years of absolute belief, it instantly evaporates. Bernard doesn't just realize he's been sleeping with a man. He realizes every single moment he holds dear is a fabrication. The terrified maiden in Beijing, a lie. The miraculous pregnancy, a lie. The frantic whisper promises in the dark, a lie. And the teenager Dudu, the boy he raised and loved his own flesh and blood. A subsequent blood test confirms what is now painfully obvious. Bernard is not the father. The child was bought from an orphanage. Bernard is entirely hollowed out. The psychic break is so violent, so overwhelming that he cannot survive in this new reality. Later, sitting alone in his holding cell, the weight of the humiliation and the betrayal crushes him. Bernard finds a razor blade. He snaps the plastic off, extracts a thin strip of the metal, and slashes his own throat. He wants to die. He needs to die. Because the world he woke up to that morning, it no longer exists. But even in this, Bernard doesn't get his tragic operatic ending. The guard finds him bleeding out on the cell floor. They rush him to the hospital, and they save his life. He survives the suicide attempt, which means he now has to wake up and face the public, and he has to stand trial for treason as the bigging laughingstock in the history of France. When asked later by a journalist how he felt in the moment, Bernard delivered a quote that was heartbreaking and terrifying. He shattered everything I believed in, Bernard said. He destroyed my life. I was 20 and I was in love. Let's pause for a second and really look what's happening inside Bernard's head. Because the greatest tragedy of this entire case isn't the treason, it's the internalized homophobia. We have to remember the era. In the early 1960s, Bernard is a young man from the French provinces who has already had some same-sex encounters, and they terrified him. He grew up in a society that told him his desires were unnatural, shameful, and unmanly. So what does he do? He runs. He takes a job halfway across the world in Beijing, not just to find adventure, but to escape himself. He goes looking for a cure. He is desperately searching for a sweeping, epic, heterosexual romance that will finally validate his manhood and to prove to the world and himself that he is normal. And this is the exact psychological wound that Shi Pei Pu exploits. But here is the devastating, almost cruel irony of the butterfly spy case. In a desperate attempt to run away from being gay, Bernard ends up completely, obsessively in love with another man. He didn't fall in love with a biological woman. He fell in love with a man's performance of femininity. He fell in love with Schur's mind, his theatricality, and his delicate grace. It was, at its absolute core, a queer relationship deeply suffocated by the closet. There were two men navigating an incredibly dangerous world, wrapped in a heteronormative costume that one of them didn't even realize they were wearing. If Bernard was born in a different time, if he had grown up in a different society where he was allowed just to be a gay man, without shame, none of this would have ever happened. The state secrets would have stayed in the filing cabinets. The fake son would have never been bought. The treason would have never occurred. The real horror story here isn't the espionage. It's the psychological prison of the closet. Bernard was so blinded by his need to be straight that he would willingly walked into a trap. He locked the door behind him, and he threw away the key for 20 years. So the trial, it begins in May of 1986, and if you think the French press was going to handle this with dignity and respect, you would be entirely wrong. The trial was an absolute circus. The media, they dubbed it the M. Butterfly case. Every single humiliating, intimate detail of Bernard's 20-year delusion was dragged out into public record. For Bernard, the courtroom was essentially a second torture chamber. He had to sit there, a broken man who had just survived a suicide attempt, while lawyers and journalists openly mocked him. They asked the same question over and over again. How could you be so stupid? And then there was Schur. When Schur walked into the courtroom, the transformation was complete. The delicate, modest Chinese woman that Bernard had fallen in love with in 1964 was entirely gone. He arrived dressed in a sharp, tailored men's suit. He looked exactly what the medical examiner said he was, a middle-aged man. During the trial, Schur's defense was basically a shrug. He claimed he never explicitly told Bernard he was a woman. He just let Bernard believe what he wanted to believe. He also denied being a spy, claiming that he only passed documents to the Chinese government because he was terrified for his own life. But the French court, they didn't buy it. On May 6, 1986, both Bernard and Schur were found guilty of espionage. They were both sentenced to 6 years in prison. But if you think they actually served that time, you don't know international politics. Less than a year later, in April 1987, President Francis Mitterrand stepped in. France was trying to build a better economic and diplomatic relationship with China. The Chinese government, of course, completely denied that Shi was ever their spy and found the whole ordeal incredibly embarrassing. To smooth things over, Mitterrand issued a presidential pardon for Shi Pei Pu. And just like that, the mastermind of the butterfly spy ring was a free man. And Bernard was quietly released a few months later. So, what happens when the greatest illusion of the 20th century finally ends? Shi Pei Pu never returned to China. He stayed in Paris. He lived out his days relatively quietly. Occasionally, he leaned into his infamy, performing as an opera singer for small crowds. His relationship with Shi Dudu, the boy he had bought to anchor his lie, remained incredibly strained and complicated. Shi Pei Pu died in 2009 at the age of 70, but it's Bernard's ending that really leaves a chill in the air. After his release from prison, Bernard essentially vanished from the public eye. He lived a quiet life, secluded, estranged from Shi and from Dudu, and completely stripped of the romantic narrative he had chased in China in the first place. When Shi Pei Pu died in 2009, a journalist from the New York Times tracked down Bernard and asked him for his reaction. They expected a reflection on the tragedy, a complicated love. Instead, Bernard delivered a quote that was colder than the Beijing winter when they first met. He said, "He did so many things against me," Bernard said, his voice entirely devoid of emotions. "He had no pity for me. I think it's stupid to play another game now, say I'm sad. The plate, it's clean. I'm free." But you might ask, what about Dudu and Terry? That's the $1 million question, isn't it? When the dust settled on this treason and the tragedy, you have two completely innocent bystanders that were left in the wreckage, the fake son and the very real boyfriend. So here's what happened to both of them, and it actually provides a really fascinating footnote. If Bernard is the tragic victim of his own delusion, Shi Dudu is the true collateral damage of this entire saga. Remember, Dudu didn't ask for any of this. He was an orphaned child, bought from the Shang province by Shi Pei Pu when he was just a toddler. He was raised to believe that Shi was his mother and Bernard was his father. When the truth exploded in that French detention center, Dudu wasn't just losing his family, he lost his entire identity. After the trial, Dudu, he stayed in France. Like we said, Bernard completely severed ties with him once the blood test proved they weren't related. Bernard's paternal love essentially vanished. The illusion was broken, and Dudu was just a painful reminder of the lie. Dudu's relationship with Shi Pei Pu was also incredibly strained and complicated for the rest of Shi's life. However, Dudu managed to build a life out of the ashes of this bizarre childhood. He remained in Paris. Eventually, he got married and had 3 sons of his own. By all accounts, he chose to live a quiet, private life, far away from the spotlight that his mother carved. Then we have Terry. It's actually the closest thing this dark, twisted story has to a happy ending. Let's be honest, Terry went through the absolute ringer. Imagine living a normal life with your boyfriend in Paris, only to have him suddenly move his secret Chinese wife and teenager son into your apartment. Then your boyfriend gets arrested for high treason, attempts suicide in prison, and becomes the literal laughingstock of the entire country when the truth about his wife comes out. Most people would pack their bags and run for the hill. Terry didn't. He actually stood by Bernard through the entire trial, public humiliation, and the prison sentence. And then after Bernard was pardoned by the French president and released from the prison in 1987, he went back to Terry. That's some real Tammy Wynette stand by your man shit right there. According to the reports, the two of them stayed together for decades, living a quiet, content life away from the media circus, after chasing an impossible cinematic fantasy halfway across the world. Bernard finally found a real, grounding relationship where he started life. So, when a true crime story is this bizarre, this theatrical, and this devastating, it's only a matter of time before it ends up back on the stage where it belongs. In 1988, playwright David Henry Wang turned this massive international scandal into a Broadway play called M. Butterfly. It was an absolute smash hit, winning a Tony Award for Best Play. It took the raw, uncomfortable truths of Bernard and Shi's relationship, the gender performanity, the Western fetishization of the East, and the devastating impact of internalized homophobia, and put them on the spotlight for the world to dissect. And then 5 years later, in 1933, it was adapted into a film. And if you're a fan of the darker, more psychological side of cinema, you'll really appreciate exactly who directed it, David Cronenberg. Yes, the legendary master of body horror took on the story. Starring Jeremy Irons as the doomed diplomat, it's a deeply unsettling, brilliant look at the psychology of this case, and I highly recommend tracking it down if you want to fall further down this rabbit hole. But as we know, the real horror isn't what happens on the screen or the stage, it's what happens in our own heads. Bernard built a psychological prison out of his own delusions. He locked himself inside for 20 years. And when the walls finally came crashing down, the truth left a literal and figurative scar that would never heal. And with that, thank you for stepping in the dark with me this week. If this case left your head spinning as much as mine, jump into the comments on our socials and let me know what you think. Did Bernard really not know for 20 years, or did he just refuse to see what was right in front of him? You can find all the links to join the conversation right down in the show notes. And please, if you're enjoying the show, hit that follow button and leave a rating. It's the absolute best way to support the show and help me grow. I'm Matt, and this has been Homicidal Tendency. Until next time, stay safe and trust no one.